In 1549, a Portuguese priest stepped out onto a muddy river bank in the Amazon. He's wearing this heavy woolen robe carrying a Bible, and his explicit mission is to locate indigenous populations and save their souls.
Right.
Fast forward to today. You have these high-tech helicopters packed with GPS screens, satellite maps, manufactured goods, and they are hovering over the Javari Valley. They're preparing to drop steel machetes into uncontacted villages to do essentially the exact same thing.
Yeah, the contrast there is, I mean, visually, it's incredibly stark.
Exactly. And that continuous, unbroken narrative is the mission of our deep dive today. We're looking at a 500-year spiritual crusade in Brazil that realistically never actually ended.
No, it hasn't. You look at a 16th century wooden sailing ship on one hand and a modern drone mapping the forest canopy on the other, and it feels like two different worlds. But the underlying mechanics of what is happening in both of those scenes are intimately connected.
And we are pulling from a massive stack of sources for this. We've got colonial archives, church history, modern investigative journalism, and crucially, the first-hand accounts of indigenous people who are living through this right now.
Which is vital because what the documentation reveals is not history safely locked away in a museum.
Right.
It's an active unfolding process. It is literally determining who survives in the deepest parts of the forest today.
And before we get into the timeline, I think we need to set the table for you, the listener. If you've ever thought of history as something just in the past, today we're going to see how centuries-old policies are playing out right now.
And as we navigate these sources, there is a central paradox you need to keep at the forefront of your mind.
Yeah, let's frame that.
We are going to examine this horrifying tightrope between genuine, legally binding protection and lethal systemic control. The historical record really forces us to look at individuals acting on good faith theological motives.
Meaning they sincerely believe they're doing the right thing.
Exactly. People who sincerely believe they are fulfilling a cosmic mandate. But they are operating side by side with policies that result in profound cultural erasure and catastrophic physical harm.
Right. Good faith motive, devastating reality.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at colonial history in a lot of regions, there's usually a clear before and after. The colonial period ends, the modern period begins.
But not here.
No, not here. The sources show us that in the Amazon, the policies engineered centuries ago are literally the blueprint for the conflicts happening today. So to understand how we get to modern helicopters defying national laws, we have to understand the mechanics of the system that priest in 1549 was building.
Right, so that priest represents the arrival of the Society of the Jesuits in Brazil. They arrived accompanying the first Portuguese governor general.
Okay.
And when they arrive, you have to realize they do not step into an empty wilderness.
Right, that's a huge misconception.
They step into an incredibly complex, highly populated coastal region. It's dominated by various Tupi-speaking indigenous nations, and almost immediately, they step into a bitter conflict with the Portuguese colonists who are already there.
I want to break down the mechanics of that specific conflict, because the dynamic between the priests, the colonists, and the Tupi is really the engine for everything that follows.
It sets the entire precedent.
Right. So the Portuguese colonists had a very specific economic mandate from the crown, which was to establish massive sugar plantations in the northeast of Brazil.
And the economics of 16th century sugar production are just brutal to contemplate. Sugarcane is an incredibly labor-intensive crop.
Right.
You have to clear dense tropical forests, plant the cane, harvest it by hand under suffocating heat, and then rapidly process it in the Indigenous, which are the sugar mills.
Where they have to crush the cane and boil the juice in these massive copper vats over constantly burning fires.
Exactly. The physical toll on the human body is staggering. The colonists realized very quickly that European laborers simply could not survive the climate and the work.
So from the perspective of the Portuguese plantation owners, they look at the millions of coastal Tupi people living, semi-nomadically in the region, and they see an abundant, free source of energy to run these sugar mills.
Their immediate goal is straight-up enslavement.
The organized hunting expeditions, right?
Yeah, heavily armed expeditions to capture the Tupi and force them onto the plantations. And the mortality rate there was horrific.
Now, the Jesuit records document their horror at this practice. But, and I think this is fascinating, it wasn't purely out of a modern sense of human rights, was it?
No, not at all. Their objection was deeply theological and institutional. The Jesuits carried a royal charter and a theological mandate declaring that these indigenous people possessed human souls capable of salvation.
Okay.
And under that specific doctrine, they could not be legally enslaved by the secular colonists. The Jesuits claimed the indigenous people as legal, quote-unquote, wards of the church.
And the legal terminology there is crucial. They aren't saying the Tupi are free, independent nations. They are saying these people belong to our institution, not yours.
Exactly. And that distinction sparks a massive political war over human labor.
Right.
We see records of local governors constantly complaining to the Portuguese crown about the Jesuits. The priests were actively shielding the Tupi from the slavers' nets, pulling them out of the reach of the plantations.
But the method they used to protect them fundamentally re-engineered indigenous society. The Jesuits didn't just leave the Tupi in the forest.
No.
They built an entirely new demographic structure called the aldeia.
Yes, the mission village.
Right, let's look at how an aldeia actually functioned. Because when I first read the term mission village, I pictured, I don't know, a quaint little chapel with maybe a dozen houses around it.
Most people do.
But the historical schematics show something closer to a centralized agricultural fortress.
Yeah, the aldeias were massive, highly structured settlements. The primary architect of this system was a Jesuit named José de Anchieta.
The Apostle of Brazil.
That's what he's often called in colonial history. Anchieta arrived from the Canary Islands and realized fairly quickly that you cannot convert and manage a population that moves fluidly through the forest based on seasonal hunting and slash-and-burn agriculture.
You have to lock them in place.
Exactly. You have to concentrate them.
So the Jesuits essentially sweep through the coastal regions and pull these disparate Tupi communities into concentrated grids.
Yes.
They dictate where the houses are, they dictate the daily schedule, the agricultural output.
The structural transformation is total. Inside the aldeia, the rhythm of life is dictated by the ringing of the church bell. Indigenous social hierarchies, which were often based on complex kinship networks and spiritual leadership, were entirely dismantled.
Right, so the shaman is replaced by the priest.
Exactly. And the fluid economy of the forest was replaced by rigid European agricultural discipline.
It seems to me, looking at the sources, that the aldeias operated as a kind of, well, a gilded cage, or maybe a witness protection program where you had to work for the people protecting you.
That's a very apt analogy. You surrender your culture and your autonomy, and in exchange, the Jesuits throw up a legal shield that stops you from being worked to death in a boiling sugar mill.
And the historical consensus points out that this protection was very real, right?
Oh, absolutely. The aldeia system saved tens of thousands of indigenous people from the sugar plantations. We can't understate that.
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we cannot separate that protection from the immense economic enterprise the Jesuits were running. The church wasn't funding these massive operations purely on donations from Europe.
So how were they funding it?
They utilized the labor of their indigenous wards to build a highly lucrative trade monopoly.
And this is where we get into the drogas do sertão, right? The
Yeah.
drugs of the backlands.
Yes. The Amazon basin was rich in commodities that were incredibly valuable in Europe. Cacao, vanilla, cinnamon, medicinal plants, various resins.
Stuff you couldn't get anywhere else.
Exactly. So the Jesuits organized massive expeditions, sometimes lasting months, sending thousands of indigenous laborers up the complex river systems to harvest these goods.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. If the colonists were desperate for labor, and they see the Jesuits using thousands of indigenous workers to harvest vanilla and cacao, didn't that drive the colonists insane?
Oh, they were perpetually furious.
I mean, the Jesuits are basically saying, you can't enslave them to farm sugar, but we can mandate their labor to harvest our trade goods.
Yeah, the hypocrisy was not lost on the colonists. There were armed skirmishes, riots, constant political maneuvering to try and break the Jesuit monopoly. The colonial governors argued that the Jesuits were operating a shadow empire.
But the Jesuits held the legal high ground.
Right, because they classified the work not as slavery, but as disciplined labor necessary for the spiritual and civilizational instruction of their wards.
So shelter and exploitation become essentially indistinguishable. The same institution providing the legal shield is also extracting the wealth.
That's a paradox we mentioned earlier.
Right. But managing an economic and spiritual enterprise of that scale across thousands of miles of jungle presents an obvious logistical nightmare. I mean, how do you run a centralized economy when you cannot communicate with your workforce?
You've hit on the most significant hurdle the Jesuits faced, the linguistic barrier.
Because it wasn't just one language out there.
Not even close. The Brazilian coast and the Amazon basin were home to hundreds of distinct, highly complex languages. Anchieta and his colleagues realized very quickly that relying on interpreters was totally inefficient.
Right.
And you cannot convey the nuances of Catholic theology concepts like original sin, the Holy Trinity, eternal damnation through basic trade gestures.
You need fluency. And their solution to this is fascinating. They didn't just start teaching Portuguese to everyone, which is what you might expect an empire to do. Anchieta practically reverse engineers the local linguistics.
He did. Anchieta focused on the most widely spoken language family along the coast, which was Tupi, but the spoken Tupi was fluid. It varied from region to region. So what Anchieta did in 1595 was publish a codified grammar of the Tupi language. He took an oral, indigenous linguistic system and forced it into the structural framework of Latin grammar.
Wait, so they didn't just learn the language, they practically engineered an optimized version of it just for conversion.
That's exactly what they did.
It's almost like taking an open-source, decentralized software and locking it into a proprietary corporate ecosystem. You standardize it so you can control the user base.
That analogy captures the mechanics of it perfectly. By mapping Tupi vocabulary onto European grammatical rules, Anchieta created a standardized, optimized tool for conversion.
And this engineered language became known as Língua Geral, right? The general language.
Yes. And its implementation was phenomenally successful. For the next 2 centuries, Língua Geral was the dominant language of colonial Brazil.
200 years.
2 centuries.
So if you are traveling through Brazil in the 1600s, you aren't hearing Portuguese in the interior. You were hearing indigenous laborers, Jesuit priests, and mixed-race frontiersmen all communicating in this synthesized Tupi dialect.
It was so ubiquitous that the Portuguese crown actually complained that Portuguese children born in the Brazilian interior were growing up unable to speak the language of their king.
Wow.
Because their mothers and the laborers around them only spoke Língua Geral.
I want to push back on the Jesuits' intent here, though. If you deliberately engineer a language to broadcast your theology and control a massive workforce, aren't you also handing that workforce a universal tool to communicate with each other?
You are identifying the most profound, unintended consequence of this entire colonial strategy.
How a language built as a tool for religious conquest ends up becoming a vehicle for indigenous continuity.
Precisely. The sociolinguistic data shows us exactly that phenomenon. Prior to the Jesuits, you had disparate indigenous nations that often could not communicate with one another, and in many cases, they were historical enemies.
Right, they had their own conflicts.
But the Jesuits throw them all into the aldeias and force them to speak Língua Geral.
So they accidentally create a network effect.
Exactly. When you codify a language to preach to the colonized, you unintentionally give the colonized a shared voice.
That's incredible.
Língua Geral became a durable thread uniting completely different ethnic groups across the vastness of the Brazilian interior. It allowed them to share agricultural techniques, coordinate trade, and, crucially, communicate shared grievances against the colonial system.
For the listener, just imagine your entire region's diverse languages being flattened into a single mandatory dialect, just so an occupying force could explain their religion more efficiently.
Right.
And then generations later, your descendants use that exact same engineered language to forge a unified identity to survive the occupation. The tool of subjugation literally becomes the vehicle for continuity.
It is a profound historical irony, and this linguistic unity made the Jesuit operation incredibly robust. By the mid-18th century, the Jesuit system in Brazil was formidable.
They were massive at this point.
Huge. They controlled vast tracts of the most productive land. They managed a workforce of tens of thousands of indigenous people. They maintained a tax-exempt commercial monopoly on the drogas do sertão.
Right.
And they had this unifying language, Língua Geral, acting as the operating system for their entire enterprise.
So they weren't just a religious order anymore. They were functioning as an independent sovereign entity.
The term frequently used in the historical records by their detractors is a state within a state.
A state within a state.
And in the mid-1700s, that level of independent power, holding a monopoly on both land and labor, became absolutely intolerable to the authorities back in Europe.
Which sets the stage for a massive rupture.
Yes. It specifically triggered a collision with a man named Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal.
Now, if the Jesuits are the architects of the first phase of this history, Pombal is the architect of the rupture. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal, and his motivations weren't really about theology, were they?
Not at all. Pombal's motivations were entirely about statecraft, centralization of power, and brutal economics.
Okay.
In 1755, A catastrophic earthquake destroyed the city of Lisbon. The Portuguese treasury was drained.
They needed money.
They needed immense wealth to rebuild the empire, and Pombal looked at the incredible tax-exempt wealth flowing through the Jesuit aldeias in Brazil and saw a massive, untapped revenue stream that was being hoarded by priests instead of flowing to the crown.
So the theological shield that was protecting the indigenous populations from the colonists only lasted as long as it didn't threaten the king's bottom line.
Precisely.
Once the Jesuits became an economic rival to the state, the protection evaporated.
That is the exact causal mechanism. Pombal embraced the secular, centralizing ideas of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
He believed the state, not the church, should have absolute authority over all subjects and resources.
Okay.
So in 1759, which notably is 8 years before Spain expelled its own Jesuits, Pombal decreed the complete expulsion of the Society of Jesus from all Portuguese territories.
Wait, how does an eviction of that scale actually happen? We are talking about hundreds of entrenched priests managing tens of thousands of people across millions of square miles of jungle.
It happened with swift military brutality. The decree was enforced by colonial soldiers. They marched into the aldeias, arrested the priests, put them in chains, confiscated their property, and loaded them onto ships bound for European prisons.
Just completely decapitated the entire administrative infrastructure overnight.
Overnight, the system was gone.
The logistics of that are staggering. You pull the management layer out of this massive societal machine, but the indigenous people living in these centralized villages are still there. What happens to the millions of people who have spent the last 2 centuries living under this highly structured system?
This is where we see the catastrophic transition from ecclesiastical control to state extraction. Pombal implemented a sweeping new legal framework called the Diretório dos Índios, which governed the region from 1757 to 1798.
And what was the stated goal of this Diretório?
The stated goal was to integrate the indigenous populations into the colonial economy as secular citizens.
With the reality.
The reality on the ground was a radical, devastating exploitation.
Let's look at the mechanics of the Diretório. They didn't just leave the villages as they were, did they?
No, the first step was erasure. The state stripped the missions of their religious names and renamed them after Portuguese towns and cities.
So an aldeia, named after a Catholic saint, was suddenly renamed Santarém or Faro.
Exactly. And then the administration of the indigenous populations was handed over to secular directors.
And these directors, I assume, did not have a theological mandate to protect souls.
They had an economic mandate to generate profit. The secular directors essentially took the populations of these villages and leased their labor out to the local colonists by the day or the month.
Wow. So the colonists finally got what they had been demanding since 1549, access to the massive pool of indigenous labor without the interference of the priests.
Yes. The protection vanishes and the extraction accelerates. But Pombal's reforms didn't stop at physical labor.
Right.
The documentation on the Diretório shows a massive systemic attack on the culture itself. And this is where the story of Língua Geral takes a very dark turn.
Here's where it gets really interesting and tragically ironic.
The Portuguese state viewed Língua Geral, the very language the Jesuits had engineered, as a fundamental threat to national security and assimilation.
Because you cannot have a unified centralized empire if the vast majority of your colonial subjects are speaking a synthesized indigenous language that the bureaucrats in Lisbon don't understand.
Exactly. The logic of state control demands uniformity. So under the Diretório, the state outright banned the use of any indigenous languages, and they specifically targeted Língua Geral.
How do you enforce a ban on the language everyone speaks?
Through physical violence. The penalty for speaking it in schools or public spaces wasn't a fine. It was corporal punishment, whipping, or exile.
Whipping.
Yes, Portuguese was mandated as the sole legal language of the colony.
The historical whiplash there is intense. Think about it. First, an occupying force pulls your ancestors out of the forest and forces them to learn a synthesized language so they can be preached to.
Right.
2 centuries later, a different branch of that same occupying force rips you for speaking that exact same language because it's not European enough. The state turned the church's weapon of conversion into a target of total erasure.
It perfectly highlights how linguistic policies are wielded as weapons of statecraft, and Pombal's administration utilized biological engineering alongside linguistic suppression.
What do you mean by biological engineering?
The Diretório instituted explicit tax incentives and social benefits for Portuguese men who married indigenous women.
Wait, the government was literally subsidizing intermarriage?
Yes.
Yeah.
This was a documented, formalized policy of forced mestiçagem.
Forced mixing.
Exactly. The state's logic was that the most efficient way to solve the, quote, indigenous problem was to biologically and culturally dissolve the indigenous population into the broader Portuguese-speaking colonial underclass.
So the goal was intentional demographic erasure.
Total demographic erasure.
You have the dismantling of their physical communities, the banning of their language, and a state-sponsored attempt to breed out their identity. The systemic vulnerability this created must have been absolute.
It was absolute. The demographic data from the decades following the Diretório points to a catastrophic collapse. The indigenous populations were stripped of the communal structures the Jesuits had built, but they couldn't return to their pre-colonial ways of life because those ecosystems and traditions had been eradicated.
They were trapped.
They were atomized, marginalized, and completely defenseless.
And that defenselessness sets the stage for what happens next in the Amazon, because the next massive economic wave to hit the forest doesn't require sugar plantations, it requires rubber.
Yes, the long catastrophe of the Amazon rubber boom. It ran roughly from 1879 to 1912. It was triggered by the invention of vulcanization and the global explosion in demand for rubber.
For bicycles, industrial machinery, eventually automobiles.
Exactly. And the wild rubber trees, the Hevea brasiliensis, were scattered deep throughout the Amazon basin.
So to harvest that rubber, the rubber barons needed laborers to walk deep into the forest, tap the trees, collect the sap, and carry it out. And they looked at the fragmented, unprotected indigenous populations left behind by the Diretório.
And they saw a completely disposable workforce. The brutality of the rubber boom is extensively documented in historical and anthropological records. Because the indigenous groups lacked any institutional protection, they were subjected to mass enslavement by the rubber barons.
And the enforcement was barbaric.
If a village didn't meet its quota of rubber, the militias employed by the barons would enact horrific violence. Amputations, torture, mass killings. We see mortality rates in some regions during this period hitting 80 or 90%.
90%.
Yes, due to a combination of murder, starvation, and newly introduced diseases.
So the state takes over the physical land in 1759, crushes the language, and subjects the bodies to pure industrial extraction. But what happens to the spiritual mandate? The desire to save souls that brought that priest off the ship in 1549, it seems like the theological crusade just went dormant, waiting for the technology to catch up.
It did go dormant on a systemic level during the height of the state's extraction phases, but it never vanished. And that brings us out of the historical archives and squarely into the modern era.
Because the mandate to convert the Amazon is not a closed chapter. It is a live, highly funded, and deeply controversial ongoing event.
Exactly, which connects us directly to the second image from our introduction, the high-tech helicopter hovering over the forest canopy. Let's look at the mechanics of the modern mission frontier in Brazil.
Right, to understand the modern frontier, we have to look at the geography. The deep Amazon basin, particularly areas like the Javari Valley near the Peruvian border, holds the world's largest concentration of uncontacted and isolated peoples.
Though we need to clarify what uncontacted actually means in this context.
Yeah, please do, because it's very easy to imagine a group of people who simply don't know the outside world exists, like they are, frozen in the Stone Age.
Right, and that's a dangerous myth. Anthropologists and indigenous advocates stress that isolated is a much more accurate term. These groups are not unaware of the outside world.
They know it's out there.
In almost all cases, their isolation is a deliberate strategy of survival. They are the descendants of groups who fled deep into the forest to escape the massacres of the rubber boom or the encroachment of modern logging. Their isolation is a protective response to historical trauma.
They aren't lost, they are hiding.
Precisely. And into this incredibly fragile, intentionally isolated environment enter modern evangelical organizations.
The records highlight groups like Ethnos 360, which was originally founded in 1943 as the New Tribes Mission, along with organizations like SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics.
And we have to emphasize, these are not a few rogue preachers wandering into the woods. These are highly organized, technologically sophisticated, and exceptionally well-funded international organizations.
The documentation on their motivations is very clear. It's not just a general sense of charity or a desire to build schools. There is a very specific, highly urgent theological engine driving these modern missions.
Yes. The theology driving many of these organizations is rooted in specific interpretations of biblical prophecy, often pointing to verses like Matthew 24:1 fear.
Which says what, exactly?
The core belief is that the return of Christ and the end of the current age cannot occur until the gospel has been preached to every single distinct ethno-linguistic group on earth in their native tongue.
So from their perspective, locating the very last isolated group in the Amazon isn't just about saving those specific individuals. It is the necessary trigger for the culmination of cosmic history. The stakes literally could not be higher for them.
And because the theological stakes are infinite, the methods they use to locate these groups have completely modernized. They don't rely on paddling canoes and hoping to stumble across a village anymore.
Yeah.
They utilize high-resolution satellite imagery to scan the immense forest canopy for tiny clearings or gardens. They deploy drones to map pathways. They use bush planes and helicopters to pinpoint exact coordinates of isolated communities.
Let's break down the mechanics of how they actually force contact once they find a village using a drone. Because they use a strategy of gifting, right?
Yes, gifting. The tactical approach usually involves dropping manufactured goods from the air or leaving them strategically on riverbanks near the isolated group's territory.
Like what?
They leave items that represent a massive technological leap for a forest-dwelling community. Steel machetes, aluminum pots, mirrors, axes.
Think about that. If you are relying on a stone axe to clear a garden, a steel machete is an unimaginable upgrade. It changes your entire caloric output. You are deliberately introducing an item so useful that it creates a dependency.
That's exactly what it is. It is a mechanism designed to coax the group out of hiding and force engagement.
But this strategy runs into a massive, heavily enforced legal wall. The actions of these modern missionary groups are in direct defiance of the Brazilian state's official policies.
Yes. The Brazilian government has a specific agency, FUNAI, the National Indigenous Foundation, that handles these issues, and they have a strict no-contact policy.
When did that policy actually become law, and what triggered it?
The no-contact policy was instituted in the late 1980s, and it was written in blood.
What happened?
During the 1970s, the Brazilian military dictatorship initiated massive infrastructure projects, most notably the Trans-Amazonian Highway. They drove bulldozers deep into the forest to open it up for development. The government's policy at the time was to force contact with any isolated groups in the way to, quote, pacify them and move them off the land.
And the results of those forced contacts were apocalyptic, weren't they?
The demographic data from FUNAI's own archives is harrowing. The forced contacts resulted in immediate, catastrophic epidemics. Entire linguistic groups were wiped off the map within months.
Within months?
Yeah. FUNAI officials witnessed the devastation firsthand and realized that the only scientifically and ethically viable way to protect these groups was to leave them completely alone and instead focus on protecting their territorial borders from invaders.
I want to stop and look at the biological mechanics of why contact is so lethal. Because a listener might think, okay, bringing in outside diseases is bad, but surely modern medicine can handle it. Why is a biological risk so absolute?
It comes down to the mechanics of immunology. Isolated peoples have been completely cut off from the global pool of pathogens for generations, sometimes for thousands of years.
Right.
They do not possess the herd immunity or the specific antibodies to fight off the zoonotic diseases that the rest of the global population passes around constantly.
So a missionary stepping out of a helicopter into a village isn't just bringing a Bible. They are functionally acting as a biological weapon.
Tragically, yes. The epidemiological history shows that a single outsider carrying a common cold, an influenza strain, or a mild case of measles can trigger an extinction-level event for a community. The virus tears through the population simultaneously.
Consider the cascading effects of that. It's not just that everyone gets sick. If every single adult in a village of 50 people comes down with a severe respiratory infection at the exact same time, the entire social infrastructure collapses.
That is the exact mechanism of destruction. When the adults are incapacitated by fever, there is no one to hunt. There is no one to harvest the gardens. There is no one to fetch water from the river.
The whole system halts.
And the elders who hold the linguistic and cultural memory of the tribe usually die first. The infants die of dehydration. The community doesn't just die from the virus, they die from starvation and the total collapse of their survival systems.
I have to ask how the modern missionary groups reconcile this. We are looking at people who sincerely believe they are doing the work of God. How do they justify defying federal law and risking the literal physical annihilation of an entire village?
The sociological analysis of these groups points to a fundamental clash of worldviews. To the missionaries driven by this apocalyptic theology, the biological risk, while perhaps acknowledged, is superseded by the spiritual mandate.
Because of the eternal stakes.
Exactly. In their framework, physical death is temporary, but eternal damnation is forever. Saving the soul justifies risking the body.
But to the secular state, relying on hard epidemiological data, that theology looks like negligent homicide.
Yes. To FEVU-NAI and medical anthropologists, the danger of disease cannot be debated as a difference of religious opinion. It is a proven, lethal historical fact. And contact doesn't just bring viruses, it fractures the social cohesion of the group, which paves the way for illegal loggers, land grabbers, and miners to move in and seize the territory.
Contact is the first domino in the process of ethnocide.
Exactly.
And this clash between the state's no-contact policy and the missionaries' technological crusade isn't just playing out in the jungle. It recently triggered a massive institutional crisis at the highest levels of the Brazilian government.
It did. The investigative reporting from 2020 highlights a profound institutional capture. During the administration of President Jair Bolsonaro, there was a shocking administrative move within FUNAI.
What happened?
The specific department responsible for protecting isolated peoples, the unit whose entire mandate is to enforce the no-contact policy, was placed under the control of a man named Ricardo Lopes Dias.
And the background of Ricardo Lopes Dias is what makes this so explosive?
Yes. He was a former missionary who had spent over a decade working with the New Tribes Mission, the exact same organization, now Ethnos 360, that actively seeks to contact isolated groups.
It's like installing the CEO of a logging corporation to act as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. The conflict of interest isn't just a difference of opinion. The organization's entire mandate is being inverted from the top down.
Indigenous rights groups and anthropologists sued the government, arguing exactly that. And during this period of institutional chaos, reports surfaced detailing an Ethnos 360-link scheme involving helicopters pushing toward the Javari Valley to initiate contact.
And the timing of that is the most chilling detail. This push toward the Javari Valley, the densest concentration of immunologically vulnerable people on the planet, was happening in 2020.
Yeah.
Right in the middle of the global COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. While the entire globalized world was locking down its borders and utilizing social distancing to protect against a novel respiratory virus, these groups were allegedly using aircraft to attempt to breach the borders of the most isolated human beings on Earth.
It perfectly illustrates how the crusade launched in 1549 is still operating with 21st century technology. The fight over who controls the fate of indigenous bodies and souls has never stopped.
It's ongoing as we speak.
Now, we have spent a lot of time analyzing the mechanics of this history from the perspective of the institutions, the Jesuits, the Portuguese crown, FUNAI, the modern missionaries. But to truly understand the weight of this continuous narrative, we have to look at the perspective of the people living under the helicopter blades.
We do, because the historical and modern record is severely imbalanced, usually written by the colonizers or the state. But the Amazon's multi-century trauma has a very powerful, highly documented living spokesman.
His name is Davi Kopenawa.
Yes. Kopenawa is a shaman of the Yanomami people, whose territory lies deep in the forest along the border of Brazil and Venezuela.
He is widely recognized as one of the most prominent indigenous intellectual voices of our era. In 2013, he published a monumental book called The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman, co-authored with the French anthropologist Bruce Albert.
It's an essential text.
I want to dive into the specifics of The Falling Sky, because it isn't just a memoir. It is a dense, deeply philosophical text that acts as a direct counter-narrative to the mission we've been tracking today.
The book operates on two levels. First, it is a profound exploration of Yanomami cosmology, detailing their spiritual relationship with the forest, the spirits they call the Superi, and their understanding of ecological balance. But second, it is a scathing first-hand autopsy of what Kopenawa explicitly calls the white people's greed. He breaks down the precise impact of the missionaries, the state, and the extraction industries on his people.
And when he talks about his personal experiences with missionaries, he doesn't just focus on the physical diseases they brought. He focuses heavily on the psychological and cultural mechanics of conversion.
Yes. Kopenawa's documented translation of his views provides a devastating look at the internal destruction caused by the mission. He describes how the missionaries who entered Yanomami territory systematically attacked their identity.
How so?
They told the Yanomami that their traditional names were ugly, that their ancestral language was worthless, and that the shamanic spirits of the forest they relied on to heal the sick were actually demons.
It is the exact same psychological engineering we saw in the Jesuit aldeias in the 16th century. You dismantle the worldview from the inside.
The specific phrase Kopenawa uses is that the missionaries stole our words. They attempted to remake the Yanomami into an imitation of white society, teaching them to feel shame regarding their own ancestors and their own cosmology. He articulates the profound psychological trauma of being told that your entire spiritual universe is a lie.
But the psychological mirroring is accompanied by brutal physical realities. Because, as Kopenawa points out, while the missionaries were preaching about eternal salvation, the physical presence of outsiders triggered a biological apocalypse.
He documents how the arrival of outsiders, whether they were missionaries clearing airstrips or the waves of extraction workers that followed, brought diseases the Yanomami had no defense against: malaria, tuberculosis, influenza.
So Kopenawa connects the psychological erosion directly to the physical erosion. You were told your soul is evil, right as your body is ravaged by foreign pathogens.
And the timeline of Kopenawa's life proves that this isn't abstract theory. He lived through one of the most catastrophic invasions in modern Amazonian history.
Let's talk about that. In 1987, the Yanomami territory experienced an invasion driven by global gold prices. A massive gold rush triggered an influx of illegal wildcat miners, known as garimperos.
Yes.
How massive was the influx?
The estimates place the number at roughly 40,000 illegal miners pouring into Yanomami land over a very short period.
40,000 men. That is the equivalent of a massive occupying army moving into a remote, ecologically fragile territory. What are the mechanics of that kind of invasion?
The miners aren't just walking through the forest, they're tearing it apart. They use high-pressure hoses to blast the riverbanks, but the most devastating mechanism is the use of mercury.
To process the gold.
Exactly. To separate the alluvial gold dust from the river mud, the miners use liquid mercury. That mercury washes directly into the river systems. It bioaccumulates in the fish, which are the primary protein source for the Yanomami.
So the miners are simultaneously destroying the physical environment, poisoning the food web with heavy metals, and introducing diseases.
The demographic collapse during that specific gold rush was absolute. Over the next few years, the data indicates that roughly 1/5 of the entire Yanomami population in Brazil died.
20%.
20% of the population wiped out by a combination of direct violence from the heavily armed miners, mercury poisoning, and sweeping epidemics of malaria and flu.
When Kopenawa talks about the epidemic smoke of the white people, he is describing a very literal, measurable phenomenon of mass death. And what makes his story so vital for us today is that he didn't just document the tragedy. He weaponized his knowledge to fight back.
He did. In 2004, Kopenawa founded the Hutucara Yanomami Association. He realized that to protect the forest from the modern state and international extraction industries, the Yanomami had to organize politically using the structures of the modern world.
He's advocating globally.
He travels globally, speaks at the UN, and actively lobbies to force the Brazilian government to uphold its own constitutional protections for indigenous lands.
But despite those efforts, the crisis is not resolved. The mechanics of invasion are still functioning perfectly.
They are. In 2023, the Brazilian government was forced to declare a formal Yanomami health emergency. The exact same cycle that Kopenawa survived in the 1980s repeated itself.
A new surge of illegal gold mining.
Fueled by high global gold prices and political rhetoric that weakened environmental protections. It resulted in thousands of miners invading the territory again, bringing a devastating wave of malaria and severe malnutrition to the Yanomami children.
The threat that Kopenawa writes about in The Falling Sky isn't a historical reflection. It is happening right now, this very minute. The rivers are still being poisoned, and the helicopters are still mapping the canopy.
Which brings us back to the massive historical arc we have traveled today. The documentation reveals a single, uninterrupted process of intervention.
We started in 1549, looking at the mechanics of the Jesuit aldeias. We saw José de Anchieta fundamentally re-engineer the Tupi language into Língua Geral, creating a tool of theological control that inadvertently gave the colonized a unified voice.
Then we examine the systemic rupture in 1759, when the Marquis of Pombal recognized the Jesuits as an economic threat to the state, expelled them, and initiated the Diretório.
We saw how the state banned the very language the church had built, mandated forced assimilation, and stripped the indigenous populations of their communal defenses.
Leaving them totally exposed to the atrocities of the rubber boom.
And finally, we tracked how that original spiritual mandate evolved into the modern era. We see organizations like Ethnos 360 utilizing 21st century technology, satellites, and drones to deliberately bypass federal no-contact laws, risking the absolute biological annihilation of isolated peoples in pursuit of an apocalyptic theology.
And through the perspective of Davi Kopenawa, we see the cumulative toll of this 500-year crusade. The fundamental question debated in 1549, who possesses the authority to decide the fate, the labor, and the souls of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, is the exact same debate playing out in the federal courts and the deep forest today.
The narrative isn't closed. And if you want to understand the reality of this ongoing conflict without the filter of colonial archives or state bureaucracy, I strongly urge you to read The Falling Sky by Davi Kopenawa and Bruce Albert. Look into the work of the Hudukari Yanomami Association. Go directly to the voices of the people navigating this reality to understand what is at stake.
Because the historical records provide the mechanics of how the system was built, but the indigenous voices provide the reality of how the system is lived.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to consider as we close this deep dive. When we look back at the mechanics of the 16th century, it's very easy to analyze the raw economic violence of the sugar planters or the state-sponsored extraction of Pombal's government. We understand greed, but the most complex and unsettling part of this entire history is analyzing the sheer destruction caused by systems built on the sincere desire to save. It forces you to look at the mechanics of intervention and ask, when the act of reaching out to someone, whether through a codified language, a dropped machete, or a theological mandate, carries the proven biological risk of destroying them completely. At what point does our intrinsic human drive to connect become indistinguishable from an act of violence?